वेलकम टू नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्रीय संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. I'm Geeta Kocher, moderator for today's discussion. Today it's our pleasure to have with us Professor Xiaoyu. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of Nevada, Reno. He's a member of the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on United States-China Relations. He has published many works, and his famous work is Rebranding China, Contested Status Signaling in the Changing Global Order. He serves on the editorial boards of the Chinese Journal of International Politics and Foreign Affairs Review from China. His research interest basically includes Chinese foreign policy, East Asian politics, emerging world powers, international relations theory, and others. So welcome, Professor Xiaoyu, to our channel. A great pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, so let's begin with a very pertinent issue which everyone is talking about is how do you see China as either a rising power or a risen power, and how does that identity translate into global politics?
Okay, so I think, in my opinion, China has multiple identities. So the conventional wisdom often highlight China as a rising power, challenge the established power, especially the United States. But actually, China is both a rising power, but already established great power. But on the other hand, China also often highlight its developing country status. So China has these multiple sort of identity. Sometimes highlights higher, has higher status as a great power, rising power. Other time, it's still a developing country. This kind of multiple identities really shape Chinese foreign policy and China's relationship with other countries and China's approach to global governance. I'll give you one or two examples. One is that China's relationship with the United States is largely shaped by China's sort of position as a rising power, right? The conventional wisdom often highlight the rising power and established power. They typically have tensions. People talk about Thucydides trap. But on the other hand, China highlights its developing country status. That means for many issues, China want to highlight its solidarity with the global south. So China also, to some degree, does not want to take many greater responsibilities as a great power. So because it's still a developing country. So these multiple identities really shape Chinese foreign policy and China's approaches to global order and also many issues.
Yeah, but at the same time, when you talked about US and its relations, China's relations with US, one of the things which is often cited is the G2, right? And, China says that Trump has been citing the G2 and wants like a major power relations, which China is also talking about. But Professor Yan Shuotong from Tsinghua University in China, very recently he was in India and he was talking about G0. He said no country would be able to take the leadership role in the global changed order. So what is your analysis and assessment of the same, whether there would be, this bipolar world, especially in terms of the great power rivalry or great power competition that we are witnessing between US and China?
Yeah, interesting question. So regarding G2, the conventional wisdom often highlight it's a kind of good idea for China, right? You think about G2, that means there are two superpowers, the United States versus China. Then China's international status would have been sort of improved, sort of enhanced to a superpower level with the United States. But my own opinion is that my own observation, Chinese officials and many Chinese scholars, they have pretty ambivalent attitude. There are all kinds of debates whether China should embrace the idea of G2 in China. My own observation, because on the one hand, China to some degree like the idea of G2, but only partially, because China like to seek to be recognized as some sort of like an equal power with the United States, at least in a bilateral relationship, like in bilateral negotiation, bilateral interactions with the United States. Beijing want to be viewed as equal with Washington. That's sort of the part they like G2. However, why they don't like G2, or they are very hesitating to embrace G2 formally, because superpower means super status, super responsibilities. China don't want to take like a responsibility as a superpower, but also China understand like a superpower status would jeopardize its relationship or alienate its relationship with global South. That's why even occasionally we might see scholars, maybe some experts, maybe talk about China as a potential superpower. But the Chinese officials, Chinese leaders, have never used superpower status to describe China. So that's the official discourse. Superpower is a taboo in Chinese official diplomatic discourse. So that's why. But then I partially agree with Professor Yan Xuetong talking about G0, in a sense that I think right now we're in a moment like the United States now is repositioned itself on the global stage. So the United States does not want to take a leadership role as a liberal hegemonic power anymore. So even though the United States still very, very powerful, however, China is not eager to replace the United States, especially regarding all kinds of responsibilities. So maybe to some degree, Professor Yan means G0. I think he probably means that there's no global sort of like a new global leadership. So I have actually a forthcoming article exactly talking about U.S., China, and the global leadership deficit. And the article exactly talk about we might see both U.S. and China reposition themselves, and we might see increasingly lack of global leadership rather than China replace the United States or China co-lead with the United States on the global stage.
Yeah, I mean, officially, I have also heard, I mean, Chinese are only talking about multipolarity rather than
exactly
the G2 or something, which initially I heard. I mean, when Xi Jinping came to power, he was talking about major power relations with the US and all of that stuff. But now, increasingly, they are shifting towards a new narrative about, multipolarity and all of that stuff. And I agree, because Professor Yan was also talking about G0 in terms of no leadership coming as a superpower, as you are mentioning. But I mean, in that sense, if we look into China's, what is China's defining long-term strategic cooperation or competition with the US then? I mean, in that sense then.
Okay, so like China's long-term sort of strategy with the United States, here are some of my observations. Number one, I think in the past 10 or 15 years, increasingly U.S. leadership, the U.S. government, U.S. policymakers increasingly highlight strategic competition, a great power competition with China. But the Chinese officials never formally or officially endorse the idea that using competition as the defining feature of U.S.-China relationship. So that's sort of official discourse. However, behind the door, my own observation and analysis is that Chinese officials and experts, they recognize competition is big part of U.S.-China relationship. So it's a reality, even though they don't want to claim or acknowledge competition is the only or defining feature, but they recognize competition is inevitable to some degree. So then my second point is that how they manage the competition. How they manage the competition. Very interesting enough, I think China's playbook is very similar to the United States, even though official discourse, they talk all kinds of nice diplomatic language, but their behaviors or policy is very similar to what the United States is doing. For instance, the Biden administration highlighted 3 components of their China strategy: renewal, realign, and compete. Basically, first focus on domestic self-strengthening, then strengthen alliances with American allies. The third is compete with China. I think, ironically, Xi Jinping is not now exactly use the same playbook to compete with Trump. Number 1 is domestic self-strengthening. Number 2 is align, means build partnership. China does not build like a formal military alliances. But nowadays, China tried to strengthen its partnership with other countries from global south, from Europe, from Russia. And so that's sort of like aligned. Number 3 is compete with China, or compete with the United States. I think that's, long term, the Chinese policymakers recognize competition with the United States is the reality they have to manage. But my final point, number 3, my final point is that even though they recognize and they are also prepared to compete with the United States, but they don't want the competition out of control. They still want largely sort of stability. They want some sort of like a long-term strategic stability, so that they could manage all these frictions, problems, but also strengthen their own power. I think that's their long-term sort of approach vis-a-vis the United States.
You just mentioned about China strengthening domestically, but in terms of foreign policy, what are the challenges China face internally on economic or social fronts that affects its foreign policy? I mean, on overall.
Yeah. So I think, like for the Chinese government, economic growth is always their number 1 priority, because their legitimacy and sort of primarily rely upon economic growth. But their big challenge is that in recent 10 or 15 years, China's economic growth has slowed down because of a lot of reasons. Maybe the previous economic growth model, like export-driven, now face all these backlashes, especially from the West, and also demographically, Chinese society is rapidly aging, and also the previously Chinese economic growth, a big part is housing, right? Real estate. So the housing bubble now is collapsing to some degree. So all these factors add together, and I think that is a big sort of problem. Especially, I think, very importantly for China is consumption. Now is relatively weak. So there's a huge imbalance between sort of production and consumption. So China manufacturing a lot. So some statistics indicate like China's manufacturing accounted for like world total, like 30% of the world total. But the Chinese people in China, they only consume like maybe 15 or 13%. So there's a big gap between sort of production and consumption. I think the Chinese government, the Chinese leaders nowadays, they also emphasize how to rebalance the economic model, right? So they need to emphasize a little bit more on sort of domestic consumption. China should not be only become sort of like a world factory. I read some news talking about Chinese Vice Prime Minister at Davos. He said that China need to become a world market as well. That means how to expand their domestic market consumption. That's a long-term challenge for them in terms of like economic sort of transition of the economic growth model.
Yeah, okay, I'll come to this economic thing a little later in detail. But one of the things everyone is talking about is Taiwan, right? So, what is your opinion in terms of whether China intend to use force against Taiwan, or will it go by what officially it is always proclaiming in terms of peaceful reunification? What are your thoughts about how China will, deal with this Taiwan issue, and what would be U.S. role in that?
Okay. So I think a lot of international media in recent years talking about China has a timetable by the year 2027, China highly likely to use military force against Taiwan. I think all these speculations primarily focus on military capability, but for Beijing, Taiwan is a complicated issue. Primarily is a political problem. It's a political dispute with some military components. It's not primarily a military dispute. There are no good military solutions, not only because of the U.S. potential involvement, but I think because Beijing see this primarily as a political disputes, sort of for a long time, and there are some military components. That's number one. Number two is that Beijing has comprehensive approach, a comprehensive approach, almost like a big package of their statecraft, their tools to deal with their Taiwan issue. So in a sense that not only including military, but also economic, diplomatic, political, social tools. So in that sense, for Xi Jinping, military really is the last result. It's not a Xi Jinping or any Chinese leader's preferred approach, but if they want to maintain some kind of military deterrence. So in that sense, I think military there's always some kind of military risk, for sure. But I think we need to examine this issue in a more comprehensive way rather than only focus on military balance. For the United States, U.S. Long-term strategy is so-called strategic ambiguity, in a sense that the United States support the status quo, the peace and the stability, but the United States also need to carefully manage this particular issue. I think some analysis overemphasize the military component without doing enough highlight political messages. I think for Washington, it's also important for some kind of a political assurance to Beijing as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a lot about military, and one of the things that we recently heard and what was very highlighted is the Zhang Youxia's, investigation of corruption in the military, and many purges have been happening in the military. So, in your opinion, what's the extent of this factional politics in the regime? Because many are talking that, there were rumors about, so many people are against, Xi Jinping, and so these things are happening. And how do you see this factional politics under President Xi Jinping changing the course of Chinese leadership and the political path of, CCP?
Yeah, I think one popular perception is that since Xi Jinping has consolidated his power so much, right? So maybe unlike in Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin era, maybe factional politics, different factions totally disappear in the Xi Jinping era. That's one sort of perspective. But on the other hand, many others, I actually agree, is that there are also there are many factors still shape sort of factional politics in China. It's just maybe different kinds of factions emerging from China. It's different from like Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin era talking about the princelings vis-a-vis the Tuanpai, the Chinese Communist Party, Communist Youth League. So that's different kind of fact. Those kind of factions disappeared. But because of multiple reasons. Number one, Xi Jinping, even he has consolidated his power. He likes to play internal balance of power. He does not want to like anybody behind him like so strong that potentially challenging him. So he really like a balance of power, and he put a lot of his former sort of chief of staffs into key positions. So he wanted these people could balance against each other. So that's number one. Number two is that because of professional career opportunities, because of a different kind of career communities, I think different factions inevitably emerge in Chinese elite politics. So, but finally, I don't think even these like factional competitions, that does not mean Xi Jinping is not in control. I don't think some kind of rumor talking about there's a military coup. I don't believe that. I think it's more likely it's kind of like Xi Jinping.
Even I didn't believe it.
Yeah, counterbalance these kind of internal politics. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was also hearing all those rumors coming, some tanks have been shown on Beijing, and there's a military coup. I mean, it was a little more heightened than I agree that he has more of control. But from the time Xi Jinping has come to power, one of the focus of his all policies has been the anti-corruption campaign, which I think even during Deng Xiaoping we had heard about spiritual civilization, building of a spiritual civilization, and cleaning up of corrupt practices and everything. So how do you think is this impact of anti-corruption campaign on the morale of the officials, especially the PLA and others? Because there numerous cases that we are now looking at, the purges and the downfall, starting from defense minister to foreign minister, all of that is coming. So how do you see that is going to impact the morale of the PLA as well as the party, both?
Yeah, I think that my observation or estimation is that this kind of anti-corruption campaign have a very mixed impact on these Chinese officials and elites. We can imagine many elites, leaders, officials, they are very much like worried, right? So to some degree, that damages their morale in terms of like working in the system. I mean, there's some people talking about they just do nothing. If you do nothing, you will not make any mistakes. That kind of like the Chinese terminology nowadays, popular word, lay flat, right? 躺平, lay flat. So a lot of officials might have that kind of attitude. So I will not make any mistakes. That's one type of approach. The other type of approach is that maybe some like a younger generation of officials, like including POA officers, they might see some opportunities. They might see these senior corrupted guys removed. Then that open a lot of opportunities for like much younger, more professional officers potentially to be promoted in the next 2 or 3 years. So I think you can imagine the same outcome for different groups. They might have different kind of like a psychological impact. My third point is that I think in the long term, it's difficult for China to clean their system. I think if they don't have enough check and balance within the system, I think it's really like difficult, in the long term. I think this kind of corruption and the anti-corruption campaign, it's difficult to clean the system without sufficient sort of check and balance and transparency of the system.
Yeah, I think, since the whole notion of opening up and making money, when that became the center stage of China's social and economic policies, everyone was actually trying to accumulate a lot of wealth. And once that wealth accumulation comes, corruption automatically gets into the lives of the people. So I presume that it is not going to be very easy for now China to tell to the people that you don't have to be making a lot of money and you have to be, serving to the country, to the state, that kind of a notion to be imbibed. Even if, I do see Xi Jinping trying to bring up all the ideological notions of, socialism, reviving that notions, even if he's calling socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era, but it's somehow going back to what Mao's thing is. But in terms of, as you were talking about the economic issues and everything, how is the party managing the rising socioeconomic pressures that are coming in China? I mean, you talked about the the economic decline, and then there's a lot of consumption problems. So how is the CCP is managing? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think as I previously mentioned, despite like maybe Xi Jinping, Chinese leaders nowadays maybe highlights ideology, even nationalism a little bit more than previous leaders. But for them, economic growth is still very crucial for their political legitimacy. So I think they still need to, I think to a larger degree, prioritize economic development. So what does they try to do? I think they understand the reality. I mean, even Xi Jinping, a month ago, he published an article that actually come from several of his quotes talking about economic challenge. It turned out he paid attention to the consumption or lack of consumption problem from almost 10 years ago. So almost 10 years ago, Xi Jinping already saw that not enough consumption is a big problem for Chinese economic growth. I think they try to develop some policy approach to transform the economic growth model. But the transformation is not that easy. So I think so to some degree, on the one hand, they want to still maintain the current model to some degree to maintain some kind of economic growth, but they realize the current model there's some problem, like the export-driven model. They realize, right? So so they understand the problem. They try to develop, and also they in terms of even economic export, they diversify their global trade partnership. They realize rely upon the United States too much. That's generated vulnerability, right? So now even their export growth model, they try to diversify their partnership. I mean, they still try to maintain some kind of stability with the United States as much as possible, but they try to diversify their international trade. Number three, I think, is regarding demographic and others challenge. China tried to sort of develop a high technology, they highlight high quality growth, not the previous sort of low quality growth. So they highlight high quality growth model that potentially could help them, using all these high tech, maybe help them deal with using AI and other high tech widely application of this high technology to help them deal with some of the social and economic challenges. So that's how they handle these challenges.
So, then one question that comes to my mind is about, how resilient is China's economic model? I mean, earlier we were talking about, there's in China's economic model, the Beijing consensus and everything, which we can be, copied to other countries. And then the whole narrative came that, developing countries especially need to have those conditions, the national conditions to, copy that China model. So how resilient in the new, they've already come up with the 15th 5-year plan, in which they are talking about the new productive forces that you're talking about, the new quality productive forces, basically, and also about the technologies and everything. So do you think that, that China's economic model is resilient enough to sustain for the future growth or everything?
Yeah, I think, I have multiple answers for this. Number one, I think China's economic model has a lot of problems, for sure. But I think overall, the China's growth is sustainable in a long term, especially if we examine like this comprehensively. But also we need to assume that while there are many problems, the Chinese government, Chinese society, Chinese companies, they also have a lot of potential solutions. So they will adapt to new reality. So for instance, so in that sense, I think like even like the key debate sometimes, oh, is China model sustainable, not sustainable, resilient or not resilient? But I think we need to unpack different components of China's economic model. There's some elements of model not very sustainable. As I said, the huge gap or imbalance of of production and consumption, that's not sustainable. I think the Chinese leaders, they understand as well. So they need to change. They need to rebalance that. So that part not sustainable. But why I'm seeing overall the system could still be resilient because it could have a lot of new solutions. They could change. They could have a lot of like new programs to cope with all these problems. But also why I think China's sort of, even despite a lot of problems, why the overall China's political economic model is resilient, because China is a large country with so many people, such a large market, such a large sort of like their manufacturing industries so complicated, their supply chains, right? So they have a comprehensive sort of package to deal with all these problems. So that's my assumption. But I also acknowledge some component of their economic growth is not sustainable. Yeah.
Okay, so my last question to you, I don't know whether you can talk about it or not. It is how does China perceive India's growth? I mean, India is also now rapidly growing. The growth rate is much higher than what China has. It's 6%, 7% or so. So how do you see China's India's growth?
Okay, so my observation is that the Chinese, including experts, officials, they do see the great potential of India because like India now has the largest population, much younger demographic, and very high economic growth. So the fact that India is growing so fast, I think that deeply impressed some of the Chinese elites. However, I don't see like the Chinese see India as a sort of immediate sort of challenge for China, in a sense that I think to some degree any like a high economic growth for big countries that has strategic implications, right? So, but even though the Chinese recognize India's high economic growth, but they don't see India as a big sort of security challenge for them. There, I see China and India has a huge sort of perceptional or strategic asymmetry. So India see China as the big or one of the biggest or the biggest strategic challengers, given the border dispute and other issues. But China, for their calculation, China still see the United States as the biggest sort of security or strategic challengers. So in a sense that there is a sort of asymmetrical perception there. But I think related to China-India relationship, given this asymmetrical relationship, I think sometimes Indian maybe are very sort of sensitive or sometimes oversensitive to China's policy and behaviors. It looks like every Chinese policy behaviors seems to be like a purpose with the purpose to contain India. Actually, probably that's not the reality. For China, the Chinese elites, they they should be a little bit more sensitive to Indians' concern. I think if we think in the long term, China-India relationship want to improve, both sides need to recognize the asymmetrical of the perception and try to rebalance their relationship in the long term. Yeah.
Yeah, so on that positive note that, India, China should understand each other, cooperate with each other, and build, more understanding with each other. That's the crux of everything. Thank you very much, Professor Xiaoyu. It was interesting talking to you. A very interesting conversation, of course. And I hope our viewers would like this. And please, to our viewers, please like and subscribe the channel. You would have many more interesting discussions that would be very useful for you. And please share our channel with your friends and family and relatives, everyone who would love to know about China more, and very authentic and true perspectives from various scholars and diplomats and known people from this area. Thank you very much and namaskar.